Let's get started. Again, welcome to our webinar today, How to Select the Best Location for Serving the U.S. Market, presented by Michelle Comerford of Biggins Lacey Shapiro and Company and Harry Mosier of the Reshoring Initiative. Given the tariffs uncertainty and changing global market dynamics, many companies are grappling with the question of where they should manufacture products in order to best serve the U.S. market. There are many elements that weigh into these decisions, and today that is what we're going to address. First, let's introduce our speakers. This is Michelle Comerford with Biggins Lacey Shapiro and Company. We are a professional site selection consulting firm which helps companies evaluate and make location strategy decisions all across North America and also internationally through some partnerships. I am the industrial and supply chain practice leader within BLS and have spent most of my 16-year career in this industry working with manufacturing and distribution clients across a wide variety of sectors on their location strategies across North America. Joining me today, my esteemed panelist colleague is Harry Mosier, and Harry founded the Reshoring Initiative to bring manufacturing jobs back to the U.S. via reshoring and foreign direct investment. After working for many years for GF Aggie Carmeals, starting as president in 1985 and retiring at the end of 2010 as chairman emeritus. Largely due to the success of the Reshoring Initiative, Harry was inducted into the Industry Week Manufacturing Hall of Fame in 2010. He's frequently quoted in the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, The New Yorker, USA Today, and seen or heard on Fox Business, Market Watch, and other national TV and radio programs. He also has some esteemed degrees in engineering from MIT as well as the University of Chicago. Harry will be talking about reshoring from a global context, and although the purpose of the Reshoring Initiative is to encourage investment in the U.S., Harry's approach is really based on the business decision-making principles and acknowledges that the business case for the U.S. must first be made, and that might not actually apply to all companies. With that, I will turn it over to Harry.
Thank you, Michelle. I appreciate it. Michelle mentioned bringing work to the U.S. via reshoring, but also via FDI. And today's presentation is obviously largely focused on FDI. And at the moment, Michelle, I'm not able to advance. There it goes. Okay. So we're talking about selecting the best country for your manufacturing plant and picking the that's my responsibility. I'm going to talk about that, and then Michelle's going to talk about if you have decided that the U.S. is the best choice, in which state, in which city might you decide to place that factory? So the question is, for my section, is it more cost effective to supply the U.S. from your home country, a company that's in Germany, Italy, Japan, somewhere, from a low labor cost country such as China, or from a U.S. facility? Obviously, the home country says that's where engineering is, that's where we are today. The low labor cost country obviously can save you on manufacturing cost, and the U.S. facility puts you local to the marketplace, which saves a lot on what we call the hidden costs, the costs that companies often ignore, but can make quite a difference in the analysis, the benefits of proximity. So, Michelle, if you'll advance the slide. So the sample case that I've analyzed is I've picked a German company because that's certainly a very strong manufacturing country, and that in the assumption does not have a U.S. factory, and is deciding whether to supply the U.S. market by expanding its own factory in Germany, or from a new factory in China, or a new factory in the U.S. So assumptions: there's no extra capacity available anywhere, so they can't solve the problem just by running the German factory more hours, and the engineering will stay in Germany at least through the medium term. In other words, we're talking about a factory as opposed to a freestanding division. And the objective that I selected was to maximize near-term profitability and create longer-term stability. So get a good return now and have something that will stay together in the future. Next. So first, some general, what I call competitiveness statistics. This is data that relates to the manufacturing cost, and it doesn't matter very much where the product will be shipped, what market will be served. It's just what's the X-Works manufacturing cost or X-Works price going to be. So manufacturing labor, obviously a very, very important characteristic. Germany is the highest. U.S. is pretty close. China is dramatically lower, but on the other hand is well higher than it was 15 years ago. The $4.80 is up from 50 cents or $1 15, 20 years ago. Natural gas might be important to your facility, might not be. U.S. is low. Germany's in the middle. China tends to be high. Electricity, again, U.S. is low. China's in the middle. Germany is high. And these numbers are, as it notes at the bottom, national averages, and the values vary widely within each country, and that's why Michelle will look at the variation of these things within the U.S. and help you find good choices within the country if that turns out to be the right choice. Building costs, so the cost of land and building in each of the countries. This is an index, so it's not dollars per square meter or anything like that, or euro. It's an index, so it's a relative number. Corporate tax rate, China's low at 25%, U.S. at 25.7%. There's a blend of the new reduced U.S. Federal tax rate and the average of the state tax rates around the country. Germany is a bit higher at 30%. Manufacturing Competitive Index suggests, this is an estimate for 2020, how competitive overall each country would be. And it isn't quite cost of product competitiveness. It includes the whole thing with technical capability and other considerations, but all relatively close. The U.S. expected to be the leader by 2020. Output per worker, thousands of dollars per year, substantially higher in Germany and the U.S. I think it looks like a factor of 4 to 1 roughly there. I think that overstates the productivity a bit because it's measured in value added, and the product coming out of China is obviously a lower value added for the same product. That's why they get to export so much of it. And so probably the real productivity ratio is more like 3 to 1 rather than 4 to 1. Local supply base, all pretty good. On a 1 to 7 with 7 high. Germany, the best. They're famous Mittelstand with all the privately owned companies that make up that supply base. The U.S. second, China third, and I think it's fair. The Chinese obviously have a huge number of these suppliers, and they can produce a great variety of products and fairly high levels of integration of products, but overall perhaps still not quite the quality that the U.S. or Germany would have. Next slide. So some other considerations in addition to those general ones. Once you get to the U.S. development incentives, or for any of the countries' development incentives, the fact that since we're targeting the U.S. market in this case, approximately 37% of consumers say they'll pay 10% or more for made in USA products. Now, it's hard to prove whether they will actually do it, but survey after survey says that they will, and there have been companies that have been able to launch products or switch products from imported to made in USA and been able to raise price, increase volume, and benefit from that made in USA label. And that's a consideration if you're going to be selling in the U.S. We've all read a lot about the trade actions and the tariffs, and that certainly is something you have to think about. Most of the publicity so far is relatively unfavorable, but in the long run, I believe that the U.S. will manage to create a more competitive manufacturing position that will reduce its trade deficit. That's what President Trump wants to do. And whether that happens with tariffs or a lower dollar or a value-added tax, one way or the other, something will happen, or some things will happen that will make the U.S. more competitive, continuing the trend achieved with the lower tax rates and the lower regulations. And that will, to me, that means there's some advantage over the next years of having a factory in the U.S. and being inside that umbrella or wall. Next. So I picked a variety of characteristics and created a scoring system. So you'll see 4 or 5 different groups of these on the next 3 or 4 slides. I grouped them by topic, like this topic is product, and I compared each of the countries for which is the most favorable setting, depending on whether your product has that characteristic. So if you have frequent design changes, I'd put Germany first because they have such a strong, very technically competent and large supplier network. I put the U.S. second, and partially because you're going to be supplying the U.S. market, and then China third. If there's a volatile demand, then logically it makes sense to be in the U.S. And second, about equally between Germany and China, because if demand is volatile, given that you want to be able to supply very quickly in these days of e-commerce, there's a lot of value to having your factory close to the market or in the market. The product is customized or locally adapted. Again, logic of being in the market rather than outside the market. So the idea on this, I'm going to go through a bunch of these things, and when you look at them, pick the rows that are relevant to your case. So all of these 3 might be relevant, none of them might be relevant. So delete the ones that are not relevant, and then if you add up the columns, the column or the country that comes up with the lowest total is the one that should at least get some serious consideration. You'll see some of the text is in red, and the ones in red represent relevant characteristics that are most important for the U.S. case. Next, please. Okay, so now you can see some of the red. So in terms of the market, I think a very important consideration that the North American market, either the U.S. or the North American market, can absorb a factory's output. There's some critical mass. You don't want to build a factory to make $100,000 a year worth of a product. It's $1 million, it's $5 million, it's $20 million, depending very much on your product and the size of the market. You want, can the North American market absorb that much output? And if it can, then it makes sense to have a devoted U.S. factory. If it doesn't, then it might make more sense to supply from Germany or China. Now, are there any significant U.S. competitor factories? If not, then your factory will be the only domestic supplier of the product, and that should give you a substantial advantage over the competitors that are importing into the U.S. So I think these are very, very very strong factors, if they're true in your case, and they would favor the U.S. Higher risk or safety products, Germany and U.S. about equal, China lower. If you need capacity for the Chinese market also, say that market's growing for you, then that might tend to put China towards number 1. Next, please. So here's a group of factors related to manufacturing. If it's labor intense, obviously China. If labor experience is essential, then I'd put Germany first. If advanced manufacturing is likely to be used, Germany is very good. U.S. is close, but I'd still put Germany first. You need a technically very strong supply chain. I'd put Germany first. But if you need a supply chain that's really good at making sub-assemblies almost all the way up to the complete product, China's very good at that, and I'd put them first. Does the capital equipment come primarily from Germany? And if so, obviously Germany, you don't have to ship it so far if your factory's in Germany. If you put it in the U.S., there's no value-added tax on the product coming in, the machine equipment coming in, whereas if it's in China, there is a value-added tax. And I've talked to companies that have higher burden rates in China than they do in the U.S., significantly because of the value-added tax that drives up the capital cost of their equipment. If it's skilled labor intense, I'd say Germany. If it's feasible to achieve a Made in USA label, now this can be very important. I think it could be worth 10% on your selling price and something on your volume. In that case, I put the U.S. first. High mix, low volume, again, makes sense for the U.S. We saw before that electricity and natural gas are both least expensive in the U.S. Next, please. In terms of logistics, if the freight cost is high, logically U.S. If it's high profitability, I put China and U.S. tied, both having the lowest tax rate. So you'd like to, if you have a high profitability product, you'd like it to be produced where the tax rates are relatively low. If there's IP risk, U.S. and Germany. If there's tariff risk, so if you think the product is likely to be subject in the future to tariffs imposed by the U.S., then U.S. would tend to be the choice. Company culture, so if there's a priority on sustainability, if green, if the climate is an important consideration, then the U.S. and Germany would tend to be first. I've done some studies on China and with the relatively dirty production of electricity and pollution and shipping pollution and so on. You can substantially have a better sustainability condition in the U.S. and almost the same in Germany. So you can, again, the idea is to delete the rows that don't make sense for your product and then add up the numbers, and the one that has the lowest number, which would be mainly ones, for example, would tend to be the one that is at this point looking pretty good. Next, please. So some background information. Michelle mentioned the trend in reshoring and FDI. You can see here the annual number of jobs reshored in blue and brought back in FDI. These are announcements. The actual jobs take place maybe a year later. But you can see that in 2017, the total for reshoring and FDI was about 171,000 jobs, which was up 50% from 2016 and up 2,800% from 2010. So a rapid rate of shifting of work to the U.S. And much of it came in 2017 because of anticipation of lower tax rates and lower regulations, which have materialized. Next. So an important consideration, companies went abroad or didn't come to the U.S. because significantly because of mainly because of ex-works price was lower, and that was mainly driven by labor costs. And this chart shows the index unit labor costs in manufacturing in U.S. dollars for a variety of countries. Does happen to have Germany here and the U.S. and China. And you can see Germany has moved around pretty close to what the U.S. has done, but China has gone up dramatically. So it's about their unit labor cost is about 5 times as high now as it was 18 years ago. And that's because they've had their wages going up at about 10 to 15% a year for about 15 years, and expected to continue because they have a severe shortage of labor in China. So that is tending to drive the tendency for work to come out of China. And so the question is, is it still low enough to make it the right place for your work, or is it getting to the range where it's no longer quite the attraction that it had before? Next. So in addition to understanding the manufacturing cost, we believe it's important to look at the total cost of ownership. So TCO, total cost of ownership. And TCO starts with the ex-works price and adds to it about 29 other factors, including the obvious things like the duty and the freight, the carrying cost of inventory. You need dramatically more inventory when you're shipping from abroad. The benefit of having a quick response so that you almost never stock out, and therefore you don't lose orders to competitors because of lack of availability. And travel costs, quality costs, intellectual property risk, all these things come into this calculation. It's available free on our website to use. Anybody can use it. And at the end of my section of this, there's a URL that you can use to get to that location. In this case, the red circle, the red dot, it was a Chinese ex-works price at 70. The blue triangle is a U.S. ex-works price at 100, so $30 difference. So pretty easy decision, get it made in China and ship it to the U.S. But if if when the company does total cost of ownership and they see the Chinese total cost is 98, the U.S. is 108, and that within a couple of years the Chinese total cost will be higher, well, now it's not so obvious that you should go to China, and therefore it makes a lot of sense to do the math and look at the total cost instead of just the ex-works price. Next, please. So we've had hundreds of people use this for real calculations to help their company make better decisions. And this histogram shows the distribution of those cases with the Chinese ex-works price as a percentage of the U.S. ex-works price. You can see the mode or the median is somewhere around 70%. So typically, if we can use that term, typically the Chinese product ex-works price is about 70% of the U.S. Next slide. We can see here the brown graph, which is just a smooth version of the bar chart you saw before, and that's again still the Chinese price as a percentage of the U.S. price, and the green graph is the Chinese total cost of ownership as a percentage of the U.S. total cost. You can see how the central tendency or the mode has shifted about 15 percentage points to the right, and a substantial portion of the area under the green curve is now above 100%, now has a total cost for China higher than the total cost for the U.S. So now it still isn't all. It's still maybe 25, 30% of the area under the green curve. So we're not saying that in all cases the TCO will be lower for the U.S., but we're saying there's enough of it that if you're trying to decide on China versus the U.S., that it pays to look at the total cost rather than just looking at the wage rate or the ex-works price. Next slide, please. So here we've taken the same data for Europe and for the U.S. In Europe, I took, because we didn't have quite enough cases for Germany, so I took all of Northern Europe, fairly similar cost structure. And you can see that the price is in a somewhat similar position relative to the U.S., and the TCO again is shifted 15% or so to the right. Next slide. So to summarize the data on those two previous charts, if we compare German and Chinese prices and TCO versus the U.S., the percentage of the product with price above the U.S. price, if you look at price, for Germany and Europe about 25%, for China less than 10%. But if you look at total cost, then for Germany it's maybe 40%, and U.S. is 25%. So a substantial portion, but far from even half, clearly makes sense to produce in the U.S. instead of in the other countries and shipping to the U.S. I note at the bottom that the data is likely biased against the U.S. since it represents products now being imported. So why do people get products imported? Because they can get them, generally they can get them for less offshore. So the sample that's being analyzed is cases where the company is now importing from offshore, from their own factory or from another source, and therefore if we included the sample where they are producing domestically instead of importing, I believe the shift, the curve should be even further to the right. But at least this gives you some insight. Next. So I made up a sort of a theoretical case and looked at a variety of factors which I could then use to create after-tax earnings as a percentage of investment. So something like ROI on the project. And so in this case, revenue in millions of dollars per year, 50 million for Germany, 50 million for China. For the U.S., I said 55 on the assumption that you're able to get a made in USA product and therefore get that 10% premium for the product. Manufacturing cost in dollars per year, millions of dollars per year, highest in Germany, just a little bit lower in the U.S., substantially lower in China because of the lower wage rates. The hidden costs, these total cost of ownership things I talked about, the logistics, et cetera, obviously the lowest in the U.S. because you're in the market, in between in Germany and highest in China, because of it's a little further away, intellectual property issues, quality issues, etc. Investment, including inventory, based on the data we had on plant, land, etc. The same in Germany and U.S. roughly, and moderately lower in China, depending, of course, on the mix of building cost versus equipment cost. And each case has to be done on its own. And then taking that data and analyzing it, I came up with about the 4, 14, and 20% returns that you see there. But I note these key drivers. The hidden costs are important. The premium price for made in USA, if you can't achieve that, it changes a lot. The Chinese labor costs obviously help China substantially. And this is very dependent on the choice of product. Another product could have come out with entirely different percentages. Next. So skilled labor force is an issue everywhere. I've been a leader of some large international organizations, and every country complains about its lack of skilled workforce. The German apprenticeship system has been the gold standard. Germany and Switzerland say the gold standard, but it's starting to have recruiting problems now as their students, like the students in the U.S., increasingly want to go to university rather than become a toolmaker, welder, etc. China certainly has quantity, but still typically lacks the top experience. The U.S. has experience, but it lacked a strong apprenticeship program. Never had as good a one as Germany, and what we did have largely died out after World War II. Recruiting has not been good. Now the problem is widely acknowledged. President Trump and a variety of large manufacturing companies and other companies have committed to hundreds of millions of dollars and about 4 million apprentices. There's a strong credentialing program going on. There's NIMS, MSSC, AWS, that's the American Welding Society, with their credentialing programs typically growing 10 to 15% per year for the last 10 years. And if it can be helpful to you, the Reshoring Initiative can provide data by state for the credentialing programs. In other words, how many credentials are being awarded in each state, which might help you make decisions between the states. Next. So some takeaways. Every project is different and will have different requirements to consider in the decision. You could, in this, Germany came out third for a different product, different analysis. It could have been first. A U.S. location likely requires the large enough North American market to support output of the factory, like I talked about before. If it could be helpful to you, the Reshoring Initiative can identify the volume of imports and the offshore suppliers in your product category, which might be helpful to you in making that decision. If your project matches most of the characteristics that I outlined above, those rows, then U.S. is likely to be the best choice. If it doesn't match a lot of those, then probably not. The tax rate reduction enacted in 2017 has helped make the U.S. a more favorable business location. If made in U.S. is not feasible, U.S. ties with China. If most of the characteristics are not relevant, U.S. ties with or trails China. Next. Michelle, next slide. Okay, so we just say do the math. Here are the links that we have available to help you find some of these tools, and we're here to help you do the math on site selection between countries. So with that, we've talked about how to decide which country to place your factory in to supply the U.S. market. Michelle will now present insights into how to pick the optimal U.S. location. Michelle?
Great. Thanks, Harry. That was really great. Just a reminder to the audience, again, if you have any questions, please submit them in the chat box, and we'll be addressing those here at the end. We've planned on some time at the end to answer questions. So building on Harry's sample project and the outcome of that, so let's say that the U.S. does appear to be the best choice, and you're ready to put some time and effort into evaluating location options there. Now what do you do? As Harry mentioned earlier, keep in mind some of the data that he used when comparing the U.S. to these other countries, he was using national average data. And when it comes to a large and diverse country like the U.S., those costs are going to vary widely, and there very likely can be opportunities for even further cost savings on a local basis. So really important to understand how to dig into local location options and how do we do that. So let's talk a little bit first about what we're seeing at BLS and in the market in general. There are a lot of headlines and announcements about reshoring, new investment or foreign investment, basically companies that are locating their first ever U.S. plant or their first plant in the U.S. in a long time. And a lot of this is really based on some global economics that have been changing, not just in the past 2 years, but really over the past 6, 7, 8 years, where wages in China have started to go up, the cost of shipping product because we were importing so much, that some of that cost advantage started to go down, and also locally in China, their market started to demand more product that was made there. At the same time, in the U.S., as far as serving the U.S., customers are, demanding products faster, and so companies are trying to achieve, how do we reach people faster? How do we, hold less inventory because we were worried about risk of disruption of our supply chain when we're producing halfway across the world? And how do we speed product development? It's a race to get these new products up and running faster. And the reality is, in addition to all those things changing, at the same time, our technology has increased in our automation, and especially as it relates to manufacturing process, has gone up. And so that has allowed more and more companies to actually consider the U.S. over a low-cost country because they've become a little less reliant on labor. And so as much as the tax reform has been great to sort of swing the pendulum even further, some of these other factors have been what has driven a lot of this trend. With that, though, come some challenges. And so when it comes to the U.S. and looking for new locations, some things that you've got to be aware of and keep in mind: manufacturing activity in general is up because of everything we just talked about. The unemployment rate then has gone down. There's a lot of people have been hiring. So we're currently, the U.S. on a national average is under 4%. I think it's 3.9% as of last month. So that is a real challenge in some areas to find workers. And with that automation that I mentioned, skilled labor is in the highest demand that it's been. Needing to find people to operate the equipment and then maintain it and fix it and retool it is critical. Also, timelines are very short. Companies are wanting to get up and running quickly, and so they're hoping to find existing buildings in the marketplace. And coming out of the recession that we had in the U.S. 5, 6, 7 years ago, development of industrial space was down. And so now we're at this place where the vacancy rates are very low for existing space. Some developers are starting to build new spec space, but there's just not a lot of existing building space out there. At the same time, there are also a lot of great opportunities. The labor force is growing. There are underemployed people who have been working in part-time or jobs that aren't fully utilizing their skill level, coming out and looking for new job opportunities. So some of that straight unemployment rate number is a little deceiving because there are also underemployed people out there looking. With the skilled labor demand, and as Harry mentioned, on a national basis, the U.S. is addressing some things, and even then on a state and especially local basis, there are a lot of technical schools and community colleges out there that are offering and promoting programs that help train workers with these skill sets that companies are looking for. And you can find a lot of great examples out there, but it can tend to be very locally focused or regional based on sector in that area. These schools are many times hungry to create customized training programs for a company to come into their area. So there's a lot of great opportunity out there for that. On the real estate side, as the existing building availability is down, a lot of communities or private owners are investing some time and money into getting their sites, what is called shovel ready, where they're doing a lot of the prep on a site ahead of an actual buyer. So things like environmental studies and soil borings, geotechnical analysis, things that take some time. They're trying to do all that stuff up front. So then when a prospective buyer comes, that site is ready to go. It is, well advanced from a typical timeline of developing a site. And so that can help you still meet the aggressive timeline to get up and running, and still constructing a brand new building. There's also some jurisdictions out there, state and particularly local areas, that are, again, prime for manufacturing. They're looking to attract manufacturing jobs and investment, and they're offering some really favorable and creative incentive programs to help do that, including, in some cases, things like free land. So what should drive site selection decisions in the U.S.? We get this question a lot, or we'll have clients come to us and say, I want to get the most incentives, or I need to find this kind of real estate, or, we need to find a pool of workers that have this certain skill set. And they come into the question really thinking, should that be leading my analysis, or what really should be? And the reality is that all of these things can be important. Every project's going to be a little bit different, and different factors are going to carry different weights in the decision. But at the end of the day, you need to make sure that you're considering all of the factors that are important to your manufacturing operation. So ultimately, the key is to establish a good methodology, one that helps you consider all the factors that are important to making your operation a success, and ensuring that you've considered everything but not spent too much time on things and areas that don't make sense. So a process that's designed to help you consider everything but eliminate those that don't make sense, and then focus and spend much more time on those that hold the most potential, so that you can feel confident when you get to that final decision. So ultimately, it's really a process of elimination. If you think of it sort of like a funnel, like this graphic shows, you're going to be looking for ways to eliminate opportunities and really focus in on those that make the most sense. So we're going to walk through a process that really most site selection projects should follow in order to find the optimal location and have confidence in that at the end, get all of your stakeholders on board, and ultimately help you move forward fast. So the very first step in the process, before you even start to look at the map or look at states that you think could be a good fit, is that you want to define what your operation is. What is this operation going to be doing? How many shipments do you have coming in and out of it? And are they coming on truck or rail? Do you need proximity to a port or things like that? What kind of labor requirements do you need? What kind of skill level? How many people? What are the variety of skills that you need? What does the operation look like? How big is it? How large of a site is it? How high is the clear height? How much electric power do you need on a monthly, annual basis? Other utilities? What kind of community characteristics do you want to see? Do you need an airport with access to New York within an hour's drive? So all of that you want to upfront and work with your sort of cross-functional team, people that are coming from the HR side, people who are coming from the operations side, people who are coming from the financial side, to all weigh in on that. And so that you are determining what this plant looks like, and then you can move forward with looking at location characteristics that will meet those things. So once you've done that, you are now comparing and looking and evaluating areas against that criteria that you set, against what your operational requirements are and your community requirements. So to move down that funnel from sort of a big, 50 states or, east of the Mississippi, whatever it is, to a little bit shorter, smaller search area, this is the time to look at some of those high-level screening factors. In some cases, for a manufacturing company, it can be your transportation network study. This would be the phase where you would conduct a study related to your inbound, where your raw materials are coming from, and what that cost looks like, and then your outbound to your customers, what that cost looks like if you locate in region A versus B versus C, and also service levels. If you have a requirement, you need to be able to reach this customer within a day's drive for the majority of your shipments, then that's gonna help narrow your search area to 500-mile radius or what have you. Same thing with something like talent or labor. Harry mentioned earlier about some of the resources he has for looking at credentialing programs in things like welding or metalworking or things like that by state. Something like that can be a good screening tool to use at this stage, where you can start to narrow down the regional opportunities based on some preliminary data that looks pretty favorable for what you're looking for. Utility costs, for some operations, such as like a metals plant or steel, where utility electric power is really a high cost component to the operation, you might want to look at utility service provider areas and their average rates to help you narrow down your region too, your regional search area as well. So all this kind of screening is going to move you from a long list to a little bit shorter list. For example, this map shows, as a result of like a transportation inbound and outbound analysis, where we've tested the manufacturing plant in these different red dot areas as representative regional areas, which locations were more favorable from a cost standpoint. And from there, you can sort of draw a search area that holds the most potential to start to dig in further. At this point in your analysis, you do want to make sure that you are having at least 2 or more states still in the mix, or portions of states in the mix, so that you can maintain that leverage that you'll need a little further down the line for incentives negotiation and other types of negotiation. So the next step, once you've identified sort of that favorable region, is to start to dig into that and now look for available properties that meet your needs. So this might be that existing building search or shovel-ready site search. This might be more specific labor analysis on training, technical schools and community colleges. It could be pools of labor with the skill sets you're looking for. So this is where you want to start to dig into that area and identify specific communities that might hold some good potential for you. From there, you'll want to screen that down and get ready to conduct an even more detailed analysis. Usually in our studies, we're talking about 5 to 8 communities at this point in the process, where we're going to conduct a really thorough look at all of these different factors related to the property, related to the community. And this is also the stage where you really start to dig into the incentives, both at the state level and the local level, and evaluate those things really thoroughly. So even some of the things that weren't necessarily the main drivers for your project up front, this is where these things still come into play, such as utility services, making sure that a site and a community has the infrastructure that you need, that the cost on the local level is meeting your business needs and that sort of thing. what the community has to offer related to the labor force, what local employers are there, what the business climate overall is like there. All of that comes into play at this point. And as you identify those, even on the short list, some of them will start to fall out because you'll discover that there are certain locations that don't match what you need, or a site that you thought was fitting suddenly uncover some issues, or whether that's related to the timeline or the price or things like that. So from that, you'll be able to identify, say, 2 to 3 finalist communities that hold the most potential. With those, you'll want to then, again, moving down that funnel, looking further at the incentives. Incentives can be a little bit deceiving when you just hear a dollar figure, unless you apply them specifically to the operating cost conditions and issues that are related to your operation. So you want to create a financial model that looks at both the upfront, one-time costs for developing the site and getting the operation up and running, and then the ongoing costs related to labor, utilities, taxes, things like that, and apply these proposed incentives against each of those things to really give yourself a true apples to apples comparison. A community that has an incentives package that ultimately has a higher dollar amount is not always the one that comes out the most favorable when you run an analysis like this, because you can have a situation where one community is giving you a tax abatement, and so that is showing up as a part of the incentive amount. But if you're comparing to another community that didn't have a tax on that item in the first place, they're not showing that as an incentive. They just never had that cost to be considered. So it's really, really important to apply the incentive to each location and the cost environment in that specific location. And this will give you the real apples to apples comparison and understand the impact to your bottom line. Once you, kind of simultaneous to some of that on your finalist locations, you're going to want to conduct some further risk mitigation activities. At this point in the process, everything is about, getting the cost to the most competitive place, but also making sure your risk is the lowest as possible, and so being able to balance those two ideas. So in order to do that, this is the time to conduct a thorough investigation of the site ownership, ensure the asking price is in writing, any kind of legal aspects, and get all those sort of commitments in writing. At the same time, whether it's a site or an existing building, if you haven't already at this point engaged an engineer on your behalf to do a technical site evaluation, this would be further reviewing those zoning and permitting items, looking at environmental risks, confirming the utilities infrastructure. Does something need to be upgraded or extended to actually meet the operation? Doing those ground testing, geotechnical analysis. All of that you want to do ahead of making your final decision. During this phase, you can perhaps uncover opportunities where you can take that into the incentives negotiation. For example, we've had clients where the site owner, which happened to be a community at the time, offered the site development for free for the company to get the site pad ready. Well, once we brought an engineer in, the engineer uncovered that the site was going to need basically $4 million in additional fill dirt to bring the site up to dock level high that the owner did not realize. And so when we took that back to them, the site owner, the community, came up with a creative solution. They own some other land where dirt could be brought off of that to the site. And so had we not had that sort of leverage and we're still in the negotiation process, that would have ended up being a couple additional millions of dollars for the company to pay for. So really important to conduct all this due diligence at the same time that you're in the incentives negotiation process. Once that is completed and you've completed the detailed incentives on the site that you want to go forward with, at this point you'll execute some formal agreements. You'll need some legal review and that sort of thing at this point, but this is where everything would go under contract. Just to dig in a little bit more on the incentives, there are lots of different places where incentives can come from. Some are going to be negotiated programs. In other cases, they are going to be as of right, or if you locate in this state or this community, you will automatically receive this kind of incentive. So not all incentives are completely negotiated. The best example at the federal level are these tax credits, or with the exception of the new market tax credit, but the advanced energy research and development credit, they're basically forms that you submit at tax time to achieve some of those credits. So it's not really a negotiated program that you would need to go after. But the ones that are sort of more applicable when it comes to location decision making are related to the state, the local, and then the other box, which would mainly be utility service providers. Incentives vary so widely by state and also locality within a state. And so it's very important to understand what each of these programs are and how they actually apply to your company and your operation. In some cases, some might not be valuable to you. And so it's important to really apply them in that financial model that we talked about. One tool that I wanted to mention is that is on the BLS website, and you see the address there at the bottom. We have an interactive map that is free to use for anyone. You click on a state and it will pop up a box, and you can print it off by PDF as well. Description of the state level incentive programs. This is something that we maintain on an annual basis. We're actually in process of adding Canada to this as well, but it's a good resource to go if you just want to kind of get your arms around at the state level, what do each of these states offer, and there's a description of what the programs are applied against and how they're used. Also important to understand the different types of incentives, so not just the entities, but then what types that each entity might have to offer. There are things like grants, which are the closest sort of cash applicable programs. In some cases, they will be specified to be applied only to a certain characteristic, such as an infrastructure improvement, like a road upgrade or a utility service line extension. It could also be something like free land or reduced cost land, or even building, spec building, depending on some communities. Then there are incentives that help you achieve your speed to market, getting up and running faster. Expedited permitting that a local community might be able to offer, assistance in recruiting and hiring, training assistance, ready to go site, things that help your timeline. So they're not necessarily cash bottom line, but time can be money. So they do help you get up and running fast and efficient. And then there are operating cost incentives, things like tax credits or property tax abatements, tax exemptions, things that apply to your purchases or your ongoing operation annually. So important to kind of understand what is important to you and then how each of the programs apply to your specific company and situation. Finally, you'll be ready to select your final site and execute the legal paperwork for acquisition and then implement the project. I have a note on here, a lot of construction timelines today for new manufacturing are anywhere from 12 to 18 months, could be longer, depending on the location, the type of operation. But so in the context of your site selection timeline, important to understand how that all adds up. The general site selection timeline, we get asked this question a lot. What's the average time it takes to go from beginning to end? Definitely depends on the project and sort of where you're starting, but on average, if you can have a 6-month timeline, you will be in good shape. There are some times for getting incentives approved and things like that it can add 30, 60 days to the timeline. So in general, this can be a good rule of thumb, certainly able to be shortened if need be. A couple takeaways, do's and don'ts for the process. I think most important, don't let your search be driven by incentives. They're only one of many important factors. You really need to find the place that works for you and then let the incentives close the deal. Don't assume there's a perfect site. There likely will have to be some trade-offs. You have to prepare your team for that. Don't announce internally or externally your intention to locate in a specific community until you finalize the incentives. If you don't, you lose that leverage. Do give careful consideration to your team. I mentioned earlier having a cross-functional team, so you have the points of view of everyone that will be involved in the new plant. Do invest the time to assess labor skill availability. I said in the beginning how skilled labor is in high demand, and it's a really important driver to the success of a lot of manufacturing companies today. So you've got to take the time to understand that, and it's a lot of boots on the ground investigation. Do follow a well-designed process and engage outside assistance early on if possible. You'll achieve the optimal value from these people if you get them engaged early on. I've included a couple resources here and links to some things on the BLS website. We have a resource guide for a booklet that walks through the process to select your best location for a U.S. manufacturing plant. We have some incentives guides and things like that. There are also some public government, Bureau of Labor Statistics websites that are full of data that can be a good resource. Economic development agencies out there at the state, regional, local, and even utility levels can be great resources. We work very closely with all those groups when we work on behalf of a client. Really great resource to provide to you information about their area, but just keep in mind that they're not there to be objective to compare against other areas. They're there to sell their area. So something to keep in mind. And then of course site selection consultants like BLS. This is what we do for day job, is help companies figure out the best location based on their needs.
So
okay.
Good job, Michelle. Yeah, you did great. And I hope the audience, the attendees, feel the same. We're now open to questions from the attendees, and you just type them in the chat box, and we'll do our best to answer them. And you can also, as Michelle mentioned, you can email or call either of us with questions if you'd rather keep it private.
So Harry, I've got one for you that came in. What other countries might be considered in this type of analysis instead of China as a low-cost country?
As a low labor cost country. So logical choices would be Mexico, because Mexico has wage rates about like China's, and obviously has quite good proximity to the U.S. It has disadvantages, crime, some of the corruption kind of thing going on, but it certainly offers the economics that are at least in general similar to what you'd get out of China, but with proximity. The Eastern Europe, if you're a German company, and it might be that Hungary, Poland, Czechoslovakia, somewhere over there, if you might find a good mix of skills and labor costs that could be helpful in the case. India, even, labor costs below China, but without some of the infrastructure and maybe some of the discipline that it has made China so successful.
Mm-hmm. I was going to ask about India because we hear about that quite a bit.
Yeah.
How confident are you in the Chinese and European prices relative to the U.S. from the model?
Okay. The ones I presented you were from our our TCO user database, and and so I'm confident that people put the right data in because they did the analysis and they want to use them for their decision making. So in that sense, I'm confident the data is correct on those cases. But as I mentioned, the sample is a bit biased because it's almost all about cases that are currently being imported, and therefore the companies decide to import what's less expensive. So it's that selection. We did a survey separately with Plant Moran, the one of the largest accounting and consulting firms, and it came up with X Works prices as a percentage of U.S. price, similar to what we came up with from the TCO user database. So we think there's a fair amount of consistency, and therefore I'm relatively confident in that data. But again, that's for products that the company is now importing, and therefore has already found is the cases where the imported price is less.
Okay, great. Okay, does it make sense for a company to conduct a site selection study in the U.S. and in a foreign location at the same time, and then compare the final location options against each other? I'll start with that, Harry, and then you can chime in. Okay. We've certainly had clients approach this way, and absolutely, I think in some cases a company is still trying to figure out their internal strategy, but doesn't want to lose the time to have identified kind of an optimal location in two different countries. And so I think it definitely can make sense. What I would encourage, though, is that you might want to use either the same consultant or have the consultants be working closely together to ensure that the analysis ends up being an apples-to-apples comparison. So in other words, if one consultant has one way of looking at it and another in a foreign country has another way, at the end you're going to struggle with trying to determine which is the most cost-effective and makes the most sense. So just encourage that sort of collaboration between those two efforts and not running them totally separately in order to help you really determine which is how the comparison shakes out.
Yeah, the point you make there reminds me of a case. I used to live in Shaker Heights, Ohio, and they were going to raise the city income tax, and I told them their numbers were wrong, and it turned out a big accounting firm had done the forecast with the increase, and the city had done the forecast without it, and they didn't make the same assumptions, and there was no consistency between their data. So it's really important to have apples to apples when you do something as complex as this.
Yes, agreed. Okay, what are the most valuable types of incentives? I'll start with that one again. Incentive programs are, and the value it is to your specific situation is going to depend. It's going to depend on your company and how you are structured. It's going to depend on the operation and the project itself. What do you need? Is the budget such that you're going to need some help on certain aspects to help the upfront costs work? Or are you more worried about the ongoing cost of the operation and being able to, keep a low cost over time to make that product, and how all of these location-based factors go into that, or a combination of the two? So it really depends. But I think that the biggest point about incentives is that it is very rarely, if ever, a check for the amount that you see in the headlines in the news. So, Foxconn gets $1 billion in incentives. Well, really have to read between the lines and understand how those are applied. They're not getting a $1 billion check from the state of Wisconsin, but they're getting a combination of things, or tax credits related to the building itself, then against all the employees, each employee that they add, they get a tax credit in sort of as reward for doing that. So a lot of incentives today are very much performance based, and it's really important to not get excited when you hear these and see these headlines about what certain companies are getting in incentives, because it's very rarely just a bag of money or something like that.
Now, I'd add to that in my experience, the incentives are not enough to make the decision between offshore and the U.S., to make the decision between, say, China and the U.S. or Germany and the U.S. The incentives are enough to make a decision perhaps between Indiana and Mississippi, for example. But the raw labor cost differences are so high that those, the apparent superficial difference in manufacturing costs is much higher than any incentives that anybody's going to give you. So you have to do the manufacturing cost analysis correctly, and then look at the TCO to get these, what we call the hidden costs, all these other factors, and those numbers are, I think, are going to be in total, 10 times as big as, 20 times as big as the incentives. And so if you're wrong on those early numbers, then the incentives are essentially not relevant to the discussion. So I'm not saying don't get the incentives. If you can get millions of dollars worth of benefit, certainly take them, but make sure you've done the rest of the analysis correctly.
Great point. Yes. Excellent. Well, I think we are out of time. And again, we appreciate everyone joining us today. As mentioned at the beginning, you will all receive a link to recording from this webinar probably within the next week. And if at any time you have a question that you didn't get a chance to ask, please feel free to reach out to Harry or myself or both of us, and we'd be happy to answer that for you.
Thank you, everybody. It was a lot of fun, and look forward to hearing from some of you and being of help to you making the right decision.
Excellent. Thank you. Have a great day, everybody.